I planned to stay at the university until I retired. Even before the court decided the case, the university retaliated and fired me.
I want to ask you about this new study from Yale Medical School. Some people are calling it a bombshell, finding that some people suffering long COVID are actually suffering from mRNA vaccine injury.
Mark Zuckerberg recently came out and basically publicly admitted
So crazy.
exactly what we are alleging.
I want to talk about transhumanism with you because it's really fascinating, some of your research on this.
You could create a child whose biological parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were all embryos that were created and destroyed in a laboratory, and that
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Lila Rose Show. All right, today we're having on Dr. Kheriaty. He's actually an OG podcast guest. He was on, I think now it's been 18 months ago, but today's episode is going to be fascinating. Dr. Kheriaty is a psychiatrist, and he's going to be sharing, he's really an expert on a lot of things, but he's going to be sharing specifically about some of the new research emerging from Yale about the mRNA vaccine and its potential to cause long COVID. We're getting into that. Aaron has a lot of thoughts. We're also going to be talking about Aaron's work and research on transhumanism. Did you know that transhumanism is a whole area of research right now, and there's a lot of crazy, very dark potential there, and it deserves exploration? Aaron has a lot to talk about there too. You're going to enjoy this episode, and I also think it's just very important information. So please don't forget to be subscribed to the show and pass the show on to friends and family so that they can learn the latest about these topics too. Dr. Kheriaty, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Lila. It's always good to be with you.
It's great to have you back on. It's been too long. Thanks for coming back.
Anytime.
All right. For those who don't know you yet, can you share a little bit about the Dr. Kheriaty background?
Sure. So I'm a psychiatrist, part-time private practice, and then most of my time is spent as the director of the Bioethics and American Democracy program at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And that work involves looking at issues related to medical ethics, issues related to technology and its intersection with medical advancements. And so a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today are issues that I've been digging into in my research and my writing, my speaking.
One of the things that really, I think I saw anyways, moved you out of doing the full-time psychiatry and you were teaching too, but moved you into more of this role, I think, in really consulting at a federal level, medical research, technology, these advancements, but how to do it ethically. And it's such an absolutely essential lane that we need you in. Were some events that happened during COVID. Can you just share briefly for that? Because I think a lot of people don't know, and it's an incredible story. And I think it speaks to your courage, quite frankly, your moral courage. And I think people should know about that.
Thanks, Lila. Yeah, up until December of 2021, I was at the University of California, Irvine. I was a professor in the School of Medicine, and then also the director of the medical ethics program at the university. And I helped the university to develop all of its COVID policies up until the vaccine mandate policy. That came down from on high. I thought, the committee that I was on that was vetting the policies for the entire UC system should have been consulted on this policy because of all the things that we were doing during the pandemic. This was going to be the most publicly and ethically controversial. It just didn't make any sense that we weren't vetting it through the normal process. So I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal with Jerry Bradley, law professor at Notre Dame, arguing that university vaccine mandates were unethical. I focused on universities because they were the first institutions to mandate the COVID vaccine. And I argued that this violated the basic ethical principle of informed consent, which I had taught the medical students every year in their required ethics course, and which was very foundational for modern bioethics. That failed to get a conversation going and a debate going at the university, and they finalized their vaccine mandate. And I decided that given my position, I needed to not just take a public stance against the mandate and argue against it, in the newspapers or in the medical journals, but that I had to do something to actually try to change the policy that, in my view, was violating the rights of faculty and nurses and students and people who had worked on the front lines with me every day during the pandemic and whose jobs were threatened because they were making a decision about their own body and about their own medical care that went against what the university was trying to force on them. So I ended up challenging the vaccine mandate in federal court. I did not win that case, although if I were to file that case today, I probably would win under a new Ninth Circuit precedent that has been established since then.
Wow.
But at the time, there was no judges willing to ask any difficult questions or consider any challenges.
Everyone was just
vaccine
lockstep with the COVID.
Exactly.
Like, let's just follow the COVID regime rules on forced vax, basically.
So I was caught up in that machinery, and the university, even before the court decided the case, the university retaliated very quickly and fired me, placed me on administrative leave, and then as quickly as they could, they got rid of me. So yeah, I had planned to stay at the university until I retired. That was, I was locked in as an academic physician in my own mind. And then, based on making that decision and putting a stake in the ground on that issue, I ended up, moving away from academia, establishing a private practice and working for independent think tanks like EPPC, where I'm at now. So my life changed very dramatically at the end of 2021. And as a consequence of that, I got to know a lot of people in what some people call the medical freedom movement, a lot of other people who had challenged the government's preferred pandemic policies, whether it was lockdowns or prolonged school closures or vaccine mandates or mask mandates. And in the course of that work, I also became involved in advocating for free speech and the First Amendment right of free speech, because one of the things that started happening to people like me, people like my colleague Jay Bhattacharya, who's been tapped to be the new NIH director at the time he was at Stanford, our other colleague Martin Kulldorff, formerly at Harvard, was that prominent doctors and scientists who were challenging lockdown, school closures, vaccine mandates were being censored on social media. And initially we thought this is just Twitter or Facebook or the social media private platforms that are making these censorship decisions. And, we can debate the legality of that and whether that should be permitted or not. But what we found out later was actually this is not just private companies doing it at their own, according to their own decisions and judgments. They were actually being pressured by the federal government to censor voices that were challenging the government's preferred COVID policies. And that clearly violates the Constitution. That's
crazy.
A clear violation of First Amendment free speech rights. Nobody doubts that the government cannot censor you online, even if private companies, might be able to make those kinds of censorship decisions. So Jay, Martin, and I and two other private plaintiffs, along with the state of Missouri and Louisiana, filed a lawsuit called Missouri v. Biden, which is still in federal court. We were at the Supreme Court a year ago on a particular aspect of that case, preliminary injunction in that case. But that case is still in federal court, and we're basically alleging that the federal government, including over a dozen federal agencies, was coercing, pressuring, cajoling, browbeating social media companies like Facebook and Twitter to do their bidding and to censor information that the government did not want out there. And that case, I think, has succeeded in, first of all, shining a bright light and shedding light on the issue. Mark Zuckerberg recently came out and basically publicly admitted, both
crazy,
in a letter to Jim Jordan and to Congress, and on the Joe Rogan podcast, which some of our viewers might have seen him there, basically admitting exactly what we are alleging in the case. You have it straight from the CEO of Facebook that yes, he admitted the government was pressuring us to make these decisions. Facebook and others tried to resist. That's another thing that we discovered in the case. They actually tried to put up a fight and basically were beaten down and threatened to the point where they finally caved in. And Zuckerberg himself has admitted we should not have done that. And I regret doing that.
It's remarkable.
And then he also has admitted that we censored a lot of information that was true, right? So they censored the lab leak. At the time it was being characterized as a quote unquote conspiracy theory. Now we have several government agencies saying this is the most plausible explanation for where COVID came from, is that it was leaked from this lab in Wuhan. So we were right about COVID origins. I think very few people today will advocate for prolonged lockdowns and school closures, given the collateral harms to education, to mental health, to child development, to all kinds of other health outcomes that we saw as a result of those misguided policies, which failed also to stop the spread of the virus. And there's been I think a movement also in the direction of saying, mandating these vaccines, forcing them on people was probably also not a good idea. And new information coming out from Yale and other reputable sources of medical research showing that maybe these products were not as safe, and efficacious as we were initially led to believe. So I've been for the last several years focused not only on the other ethical issues that we're going to talk about later in the program today, but also looking at kind of what went wrong with our pandemic policies, why were certain voices silenced, and how did that happen, and how do we prevent that from happening in the future? Because good science and medicine are totally incompatible with censorship. What you end up with is a false consensus, or the appearance or the illusion of consensus, because one side of a debate is artificially suppressed. So there were debates about all these policies that I just mentioned. They were just, most Americans didn't have access or exposure to the reputable people who were saying, no, actually on balance, we think this is a bad idea and this is going to do more harm than good. So we can't let that happen in the future. Free speech, free inquiry, open public debate and discourse is absolutely necessary for good science. Science progresses. Anyone who knows anything about the history of science, you know that we make progress, we make breakthroughs precisely when intrepid scientists daringly challenge the consensus, right? What everyone thinks they know. Oh, of course the sun goes around the earth. We can just look up in the sky and watch it happening. It doesn't feel like the ground underneath this is moving. So this is so obviously true. And then some people come along, Copernicus and others, and say, well, no, actually, we looked at the evidence and maybe there's another way to think about this. And that's always the case in advances in medicine and sciences. We challenge conventional thinking. And, we debate that. And sometimes the people on the vanguard who are proposing a new theory are wrong, but you have to let it play out. You have to let that debate play out, because occasionally they're right. And you're not going to get that breakthrough. You're not going to get that advance unless you allow these debates to proceed.
7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company on a mission to fund the pro-life movement one delicious cup of coffee at a time. And they check every box. This is pesticide-free, mold-free, organically farmed, low-acid coffee that is absolutely delicious. Why is it called 7 Weeks Coffee? Because at 7 weeks, the baby is the size of a coffee bean. That's why 7 Weeks Coffee donates 10% of every single sale, including the sale you can make today, to pro-life pregnancy centers. In fact, 7 Weeks Coffee has donated almost $1 million now, over $750,000 to pregnancy centers because of passionate coffee lovers like yourself. And because coffee always tastes better with a free gift, if you go to 7weekscoffee.com today and subscribe using the code Lila at checkout, you'll get a free 2-pack of their new travel bags to take your coffee wherever life takes you. And exclusively for the listeners of this show, you can go to 7weekscoffee.com. You can use the code Lila at checkout to get up to 25% off your first purchase, as well as your free gift. Go to 7weekscoffee.com and don't forget to use that code Lila at checkout for up to 25% off your order when you subscribe.
I mean, Erin, your leadership on this has been absolutely amazing. And you took the hit. Like, you were one of the first people to take the hit in a really big and public and messy way. UC Irvine firing you, and, the entire way it played out for you was kind of the signs of the worst of the times, right? That was happening during COVID. A lot of the misinformation out there, the censorship that was happening, and you just took it on the chin, and then you got back up, and now you're doing some really, I would say, heroic work, because, you're talking about, the new administration, and I know you're, behind the scenes advising folks and working with them. And I do think, medical freedom is incredibly important, but then also having clear moral bright lines when it comes to all of the advancements in biotech, as an example. That's so key. And so I'm grateful that you are out there being you. Thank you. Before getting into the biotech stuff, I want to ask you about this new study. Some people are calling it a bombshell, from Yale Medical School, finding that some people suffering long COVID are actually suffering from mRNA vaccine injury. Yeah. So there's actually no such thing as long COVID. It's actually vaccine injury. And then there's some speculation, I think, that this could be a form of vaccine-induced AIDS, is what there's, I think, calling it, or some are calling it, meaning there's an autoimmune disease now that people may have not long COVID from COVID, but from the mRNA vaccine. Have you read the study? What's your take on this?
Yeah, so I have. I think the study is concerning. I don't want to be too alarmist to any of the viewers who may have gotten the mRNA shots. There's a lot more work that needs to be done on this question, but anyone who's been paying close attention to the mRNA shots and the evidence on them won't have been surprised by the study. I was not at all surprised to see this study. It's perhaps one of the first studies to break through the sort of firewall against challenging mRNA vaccines in mainstream media or in the public discourse. And that's why a lot of people are perhaps only hearing this information for the first time. But there have been other studies suggesting that the mRNA shots may basically cause the immune system to go into a sort of imbalanced state that would compromise our immune system in the future from fighting other infections, or maybe cause autoimmunity where the immune system gets too revved up and attacks some of our own tissues. So without getting too much down into the technical weeds of the study, maybe I could just give you a quick overview of what the issue might be here. And again, caveat, we need more research, we need replication, we need more work to sort all of this out. And I also don't think it's necessarily a question of is there long COVID or vaccine-related injuries that mimic long COVID. It could be a both and issue. And the reason it could be a both and issue is the underlying mechanism that causes long COVID is probably overproduction of the spike protein, which is most likely the humanly engineered component of this particular coronavirus. It's a protein on the surface of the virus called the spike protein that looks like it was genetically engineered to make it more virulent. But
in a Wuhan lab.
It probably in the Wuhan lab,
So
as far as
crazy.
we can tell. And this is toxic to us, basically, long story short. So the virus itself includes the spike protein, which can cause the immune system to get off kilter, make it harder to eradicate that virus. But the mRNA technology basically does the same thing, because the mRNA technology is designed to make our own cells produce the spike protein, produce the antigen, the part of the virus that our immune system then can attack to try to get rid of. And the concept behind the vaccine is if we can mount a small immune response to the spike protein, then when we see the real virus, the immune system will know it, will have learned it, so to speak, already, and then we'll attack the virus more quickly so that we get less sick. That's the theory behind the mRNA vaccines. But what appears to be the problem based on this and some other studies is that the spike protein, for at least some individuals, the body just keeps producing it, right? And overproduces it. And then that revs up the immune system too much. It has an effect on potentially on T cells, which are one of the types of white blood cells in our body that fights infection. It's the T cells are the type of white blood cells that are impacted by AIDS. And that's where you see this analogy being drawn to maybe this is an mRNA-induced AIDS type syndrome, where basically we are compromising our immune system, which is what happens in AIDS. In AIDS, people's immune system gets compromised to the point where they start getting infections that ordinarily we might be exposed to all the time. But if you have the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, if you have AIDS, your body can't fight that infection the way a healthy person would. And so you end up getting sick from bugs that are out there and commonly encountered that normally people don't have any difficulty eradicating those bugs from their body, but the person with AIDS may not be able to do that because they're immunocompromised. So you can, the overproduction of the spike protein for some people may push them in the direction of an immune system that's too revved up to the point where it attacks our own tissues. Or on the other hand, it could basically cause the immune system to get off balance in a way that our T cells become compromised and weaker over time. And then we're not able to fight off ordinary infections that we would encounter and have no difficulty with. So some people, again, this is speculative, more research needs to be done, but some people have noticed, for example, that this influenza season has been especially bad, We're getting higher morbidity and mortality from the flu, from influenza this year than we have in years past. And some people are wondering, well, with so many people getting the mRNA shots, have we compromised the immune system in a subset of the population in a way that makes it more difficult for them to fight the annual influenza season?
That's a crazy thing to consider. Did the Yale study weigh at all the percentage of people that might be affected by the mRNA vaccine in terms of having their immune systems like permanently, it sounds like, compromised?
I don't think we don't have good numbers on that yet, and that's gonna require multiple studies. This study was trying to look at the underlying mechanism. It wasn't necessarily doing the kind of population-based research and population-based sampling that we would need to get numbers on incidence and prevalence. And, there's probably a range of severity of this too. It's not an all or nothing phenomenon. So you may have some people who are affected in a sort of mild way that, may not severely compromise their health, but maybe weaken their immune system a little bit. And then perhaps, hopefully, a smaller number of people on the more severe end of the spectrum where they get a much more serious condition that's closer to AIDS. So, I pray that this doesn't pan out that way, or that it turns out to be a time-limited phenomenon. Maybe we have a couple of bad years with a higher percentage of the population immunocompromised. But if this turns out, at least in some people, to be a more permanent problem, then we've done enormous damage with the reckless rollout of this novel technology, which was a concern of mine, to be honest, from the very beginning. When I heard about the mechanism of action of the mRNA vaccines, the very first thing that I thought of was autoimmunity, because we're going to be expressing the spike protein on the surface of our own tissues, right? And originally, the vaccine was designed to stay in the arm, to stay in the deltoid muscle where it is injected. There was supposed to be this anchoring mechanism so that if you got a small autoimmune response to the vaccine, it would be limited to just a little bit of tissue right around the injection site. Well, we knew from animal studies that were suppressed, that Pfizer did, animal studies in Japan, that the spike protein and the lipid nanoparticle that carries it in the vaccine travel to all the different tissues of the body. That was known very early on. And as soon as I saw that study, I said, we should be talking about this, because the spike protein is concentrating not just in the deltoid, but very concerningly, in that study, the tissue that had the highest concentration of lipid nanoparticle, and therefore probably of spike protein, was the female ovary. And we heard a lot about, even early on, reports that, again, the scientific establishment was trying to suppress.
Women were told, you didn't miss your period. Your eyes, don't believe your lying eyes. You don't know your own body.
Exactly.
There's no way the vaccine injured your fertility in any way. I mean, it was astounding, the gaslighting of American women and Western
condescending.
women on it.
Who knows her own body better than a woman who's been keeping an eye on her cycle for years or decades? And reports of second, third trimester miscarriages, which are, first trimester miscarriages are very common. Second, third trimester, quite rare, but people reporting higher incidence of miscarriage shortly after getting these shots. So menstrual related issues, potentially pregnancy related issues. There were a lot of women trying to just voice their concerns about this, and they were ignored, they were gaslit, they were told, you don't know what you're talking about. And now, a couple of years later, I think people are sort of waking up from their hypnotic state of fear and willing to ask more questions. We're starting to see research like this being published, and research institutions like Yale being willing to look at safety issues around the mRNA shots. And this is serious. We have to deal with this, because this is not the last time that this technology is likely to be used. There are a lot of people wanting to deploy the mRNA technology for all kinds of other uses, because you can ramp it up quickly. It takes years, sometimes even decades, to develop a vaccine the old-fashioned way. The idea of kind of reprogramming the mRNA to keep up with new superbugs excites a lot of people. I have concerns about this technology, given what happened the first time we rolled it out. we haven't even talked about efficacy issues, but we now know that it did not stop infection. It did not stop transmission of the virus. And whatever efficacy it had for reducing the severity of disease, that was the fallback position of COVID shot advocates. It was, okay, well, maybe we have to admit now it doesn't stop infection and transmission, but at least it's going to reduce your chances of hospitalization and death. Well, it turns out if you scrutinize the data carefully, that was probably a very time-limited effect.
Wow. That
lasted only for a few months. And after that, not only did that efficacy go away, but there is some evidence that it might have actually worsened your chances of getting COVID a second or third time. So there's serious questions about efficacy of these problems as well as about safety.
What was the efficacy of the financial benefit of Pfizer for this?
Well, there were like 10 new billionaires minted in the first few months of the vaccine rollout at places like Pfizer and Moderna. So a lot of people made a lot of money doing this, certainly. I don't want to impugn the motives of everyone who developed this technology or helped to roll it out, because I think a lot of people were trying to act in good faith and wanted to do something to address this novel virus. But I think the way in which we went about it was reckless. At the very least, we should not have forced it on people. Allow people to take the risks, the benefits, and the unknowns, right? When you have a new technology, you have to inform people, this is what we know. But also, this is what we don't know. And this is, we don't have 5-10 years of safety testing, right? So we don't know what the longer term effects of this are going to be. And you should be aware of that so you can make an informed decision. That the principle on which I sacrificed my career in academic medicine was the principle of informed consent. Tell people what we know, tell people what we don't know, and then allow them to make their own decisions for themselves and for their children who are too young to consent. That was the principle that got steamrolled. And now we have people that may have been injured by a vaccine that they were forced to take on pain of losing their job. It's really egregious.
Totally egregious. And again, it all the more shows your really heroic stance that you took. And again, you got the blowback for it, but now you're vindicated. I mean, it's like every one of these new studies that come out, I'm sure you're just saying like, the vindication. I mean, it's probably painful vindication.
It's bittersweet.
Yeah,
because obviously, if these products do turn out to be as harmful as they are starting to appear, that's going to be a tragedy. I mean, I take no pleasure in saying I told you so. It's really awful. Now we need more research on how to clear the spike protein and how to help folks dealing either with long COVID or vaccine-related injury. I have colleagues at the Independent Medical Alliance and elsewhere who are, doing work on this and trying to develop some spike protein detox protocols for people that are afflicted in this way. But, I think I worry that some of these effects may be long lasting. And so we need to redirect some of our energies now to, first of all, acknowledging that there's a problem, that vaccine injury is real, not just for the COVID vaccines, but for other vaccines as well. And I think the Make America Healthy Again movement and the appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at HHS, might open the door a little bit to a more careful scrutiny of vaccine safety issues across the board. But certainly with these new products that have not been around for decades, we need a very careful assessment. And, a lot of people unfortunately have career investment, financial investment in having these things work. And so there's also forces pushing back against acknowledging what may have happened that we need to contend with.
EveryLife.com is America's pro-life baby diaper and wipes company. And I'm so excited to share about their new products too. I love EveryLife.com and I use EveryLife diapers and wipes for my little ones because these are a best-in-class product that are clean. There's no harmful dyes or fragrances or phthalates in this product. It is designed to be healthy for your little one and good for your little one's skin. If you go to EveryLife.com/join today, by joining the Changing Lives Club, you not only get 10% off your monthly diaper and wipe subscription, in addition to that, you'll get a free tote bag, and EveryLife.com will donate a box of diapers and wipes to a mother and baby in in need. And I'm excited to share EveryLife.com is now offering training pants for your little one. These are 12-hour leak-proof training pants, pull-ups for that little one that is maybe potty training. You got to check them out. EveryLife also has just come out with their new shampoo and baby wash and lotion package. The product is amazing. I have already started to use it. That's everylife.com/join. Use the code Lila.
I remember being pregnant during the pandemic with our second, and the doctor, really urging the COVID vaccine. Thankfully I said no, but she was saying, yeah. And there's no harm. All the research shows there's no harm, and there could really be an advantage because, you could get COVID and theoretically it could be harmful. I mean, again, I'm a young, healthy woman. Yeah. And I was saying, what do you mean there's no evidence that could be harm? Well, all the studies that have been done show that there's, it's very, very, very safe. And I said, well, how long is this is a new vaccine, right? How long has this been studied? And she's like, well, this is, they've been doing their due diligence. I mean, she didn't even know what she was saying, I think, but she was effectively lying to me that this was safe, that I shouldn't worry. Mm-hmm. And, my little experience with that is the experience of millions and millions and millions of people. Now, thankfully, I didn't risk losing my job by not taking the vaccine, but so many Americans did, and yourself included. And it's just it really is an incredible time that we lived through.
And what she failed to tell you, and maybe she didn't realize this, but unfortunately, many doctors just repeated more or less the press report, the PR report from Pfizer and Moderna without critically scrutinizing it. But the studies, the safety and efficacy studies that were submitted to the FDA for emergency use authorization approval of these products specifically excluded pregnant women from the studies. Crazy. So there were a few people that got pregnant during the studies that unintentionally and didn't realize it till later. And when we looked at that small handful of women in the studies that did end up pregnant, they had a higher rate of miscarriage than the general population. Not statistically significant because there weren't very many of them. So we didn't have evidence, and the little bit of evidence that we did have didn't look very good. And most doctors either didn't bother to look or weren't aware of this, or, God forbid, knew it, but tried to reassure their patients. Anyways, so that was just not true. We didn't have evidence that because we specifically excluded pregnant women from the studies, we didn't have evidence that it was safe in pregnancy. And then following the rollout, we started to have a lot of anecdotal reports that were sidelined and that people didn't want to listen to and didn't want to investigate. So that was the state of play, and this did a very grave disservice to many women who just listened to their doctor's advice. Of course, you want to do the best thing for you and for your unborn child, and your doctor's recommending this. Most people are not going to question that. And shame on the medical profession for being a part of what essentially amounted to a propaganda campaign.
I have another question about this, because you were saying earlier about the Yale study, that it's speculative. They're still kind of figuring out what the heck's going on. But you mentioned the flu season, and I think probably people listening are like, yeah, it's been one crazy flu season. I know, like in my household, there was 2 months basically where someone was sick, and there was just, it was very inexplicable. Yeah. Why is this happening in this intense way? And there have been these really brutal flus going around that seem to be recurring. Like you get it and then you get it again, or it doesn't fully go away. Yep. I am curious if there is a theory that, whether the people affected, not all of them took the vaccine. I got the flu. I didn't take the vaccine, right? Sure. So this idea that it's connected to the vaccine, obviously, is not always the case. But is there something else that might be going on in terms of just general immunities, where people, even those who haven't taken the COVID vaccine, are being affected by more virulent flus and also more repeat illnesses because of the general shape of the population due to our COVID response? Yeah. Is there a connection there? That's a great question. And this is very speculative, but I'll mention a few theories that need to be tested. One theory is that our immune system may have been compromised by lockdowns, because basically isolating ourselves from other people and from germs and scrubbing down surfaces, manically to try to avoid contamination. The unlimited hand sanitizer. Yeah, for an entire year or more, right? Bleaching the whole world with hand sanitizer.
that is not actually good for our immune systems. Our immune systems grow and evolve and develop in response to being challenged with bugs, right? And so trying to protect yourself completely from that can actually weaken your immune system. So there is a theory that actually maybe our immune system was compromised by prolonged lockdowns and school closures and not getting regular exposure to bugs. And then we're out and about now for the last couple of years, and we're re-exposing our immune system, and it's not in shape. It's like it's like not going to the gym for 2 years. You haven't worked out, and now you're trying to exercise again. You know, you're going to be sore, you're going to be out of shape, you're going to get winded more easily. So that's one possibility. There has been a little bit of evidence and some hypothesis and speculation about the possibility of spike protein shedding, right? This idea that when you're infected with a virus, you can shed parts of the virus, including possibly the spike protein that other people can pick up, and that's how you get infected. Well, if our body is producing or overproducing spike protein, can people that we're living in close quarters with or working with who have been vaccinated, can we pick up basically some of the spike protein from them? Again, that's speculative. I'm not going to endorse that theory, but those are two theories as to why maybe even people who didn't get the vaccine, when you have an entire population behaving in a particular way, it can have spillover effects on some of the others.
If your spouse got the vaccine and you're with your spouse all day or all night, obviously, then you could still have the ill effect of the spike protein through shedding of the spouse, potentially.
It's a
crazy.
It's a theory.
Crazy stuff.
And there's a little bit of evidence suggesting that you do get some spike protein shedding, you know, whether that's been tied to higher incidence of illness or, you know, immunocompromised states and non-vaccinated people. We're not there yet with the research, but those are two plausible theories that deserve more investigation, I'll say.
Are we going to get more investigation on these things, Aaron? What do you think?
Well, I'm edified by the Yale study. I think that was a breakthrough. And I think there are enough people now feeling sort of betrayed by the medical establishment that want answers that it's possible we might get more investigations. There's an old joke that science advances one funeral at a time.
Oh, gosh.
And you know, we would like to think of scientists as being entirely objective, but the fact is a lot of times new theories don't get embraced by the scientific establishment until the old guard retires or dies because of ego, because of investment in, you know, being right. And right now we have a scientific establishment that still is holding a lot of the controls in the gatekeeping mechanisms of being the peer-reviewed journal editors, of being the primary investigators at universities. You know, things might change now at the NIH, which funds biomedical research with the new administration. But a lot of people in power in terms of what research gets funded, what research gets published, that have a strong stake in the status quo. And so it may require a younger generation coming up through the medical and scientific establishment to fully take stock. People keep asking me, are we going to have a COVID commission? My view is actually only when the people that were in high school or early college during COVID, only in 10, 15, 20 years, when they are now coming into their own in terms of positions of influence and power in the scientific and medical establishment, that's when we're going to get a real reckoning on COVID, because the people that did this to them are never going to want to admit that they were wrong, but the people whose lives were impacted very severely, I'm going to guess in 15, 20 years, they're going to want answers. Like, what were you guys thinking? Why did you do this? What happened to this? Why did you steal 3 years of my high school or college experience from me? You know, I did everything you said. I still got COVID. I got vaccine injured, or we got long COVID, whatever. You know, none of it actually worked. But yeah, I would like to think that there's a lot of people out there in the scientific establishment that are willing to admit that they were wrong. But human nature being what it is, again, sometimes science only advances one funeral at a time. So I think it'll take a long time to sort these questions out.
Well, thank you for your leadership in galvanizing the sorting out process, which is, albeit very messy and very complex. you gave this really fascinating, really phenomenal presentation recently, or you give this presentation, you gave it recently on biotechnology and the human future. So as much as I love talking about COVID, I want to talk about transhumanism with you because it's really fascinating, some of your research on this. And so let's start with what is transhumanism, and then we'll go through, some of the work you're doing on it.
So transhumanism is, I would argue, is an ideology, very influential in Silicon Valley and among many of our tech elites. And the idea behind transhumanism is to use biomedical science and technology, not just to heal the sick, not just to treat disease or to help people with disabilities or impairments to increase their functionality to a more normal level. But, we can take science and technology, including drugs and surgeries and implantable devices and prosthetics, and not just try to heal the sick, but to try to make healthy people, quote unquote, better than well, right? So this is, let's take a normal, healthy human being and make her bigger, faster, stronger, smarter through implanting a chip in her brain or through gene editing technology, or let's create embryos in a lab, and at the early stage of embryonic development, we can use gene editing and genetic testing to create the optimal human being who's got an IQ of 160 and who's got blonde hair and blue eyes, or whatever we perceive to be the quote unquote more desirable traits. And the ultimate goal of transhumanism, if you drill down deeply enough on this ideology, is radical life extension, so making the human body function forever. And in some of the more, I would say, fringe elements of transhumanism, there are these notions, these ideas that maybe using digital technologies, we can upload the contents of our consciousness into the cloud in the sky or the mainframe computer, and somehow as though the human being and our mental life is like a piece of software that can run on any piece of hardware, and we could just transfer the software to another piece of machinery that will never break down and die like the human body does. So if you drill down deeply enough, the idea of radical life extension or uploading the contents of our consciousness into the cloud is a desire to live forever, right? Which is a religious aspiration. So my own assessment of transhumanism is ultimately it's a kind of secular religion that taps into deep human longings that in a secularized culture go unfulfilled, right? So if what St. Augustine said about us is true, and I believe that it is, that you, God, created us for yourself and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Well, living in a secularized materialist culture that has no hope of eternal life after death in heaven with God in the beatific vision, no way to transcend the human and material, earthly, temporal realm. Well, those longings of our heart are not suddenly going to disappear simply because we live in a culture that does not speak to them or that does not fulfill them. And so I think transhumanism becomes a kind of secular religion, and that the central idea being salvation or eternal life through science and technology, right? We can build it ourselves. And again, there are people that really buy into this to the point where they say, well, we don't have the technology to do this yet, to live to the age of 300 or 500. But someday we will be. They're very confident that, science is going to advance in this direction. And there are actually private companies that will cryopreserve your body, or if you can't afford, basically freezing your whole body after you die, they'll do just your head and just your brain. Presumably it could be attached to a robot or a cyborg or some other, technology in the future. So that once we have the technology where you can live forever, we're gonna thaw you out and wake you up and somehow technologically revive you so that you can live forever, which, I mean, to me is a very sad thing to do. I just came directly here from a funeral of a friend who was laid to rest after a long and fruitful and, faithful life. And we were there praying for her and for her family. And, I look around and I see people that don't have that kind of hope in God's mercy or hope for a transcendent afterlife, who don't want to just disappear into nothingness and don't want to accept a kind of nihilistic view that when I die, that's it. And, there's nothing after that. And through transhumanism, I see them reaching for a solution to that. The problem with that is, number one, it's not going to work. Number two, it's going to produce a kind of nightmare dystopia for all kinds of reasons. I think the effort to become superhuman will end up making us more subhuman.
Wow.
Which is the basic
That's very
premise of,
profound, Aaron.
Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is a, great example of what that might look like. If we start manufacturing human beings according to, our own specifications in a laboratory and creating them for, this particular purpose and, trying to fulfill all their religious and transcendent longings through science and technology alone, we're going to end up in a society that is the kind of place that no sane person would really want to live in.
That is such a powerful comment that you're making, that I think you can get so excited about the technology and, folks working on it. I'm sure they have their different motivations, but in this effort to be superhuman, are we really becoming subhuman?
Yeah.
And it's begging the question of like, what does it mean to be human, right? And you're talking about, well, if you don't have a faith, if you don't believe in an afterlife, but you're also like weirded out by the idea of just becoming dust and like disappearing after you die, then yeah, you kind of want to like, I need to live forever somehow, or at least live longer somehow. What do you think are how does one explain, maybe this is the way to ask this, how does one explain the kind of core moral parameters, the ethical framework for thinking about these technologies to somebody who doesn't share faith with us, who doesn't have the same rubric? Maybe they believe there's a higher power and they generally want to be a moral person, but how do you translate ethics for that person to explain, hey, doing this like, bioengineering of the perfect human and, killing off the crop that aren't as good is not a good way to go, or gene editing the grown person to be the superhuman is not a good way to go. Yeah. How do you translate the ethical framework for somebody who doesn't have faith?
So I would start, first of all, by just trying to establish the premise that there are good and bad uses of technology. Because in our technological society, many people believe if there's a new advance or a new use that something could be put to, then we sort of have to do it. There's this idea, I call it inevitablism. This technology is coming, it's going to be rolled out in this way, it's going to be put to these purposes, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's just like this thing advances on its own. So introducing the idea that no, as human beings, we should have agency and control and decision-making power about how we use science and technology. You take something like nuclear fission. This can be used to make a bomb that kills hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, right? Which would be a very, hopefully, morally concerning use of that technology to someone who's a person of faith or a person of no faith. Or, perhaps there's ways to use nuclear fission to create energy, and, we can debate about nuclear power and so forth. But the basic premise that clearly there are good uses of technology and bad uses of the same technology, and we want to guide these things in the direction of human health and flourishing. And then from there, I would try to, introduce the distinction between therapy and enhancement. So therapy is using science and technology to treat disease, and traditional medical ethics of informed consent can, analyzing the safety and efficacy of these things can help guide us there. If Neuralink, this implantable device that can go into the central nervous system, into the brain, that Elon Musk has developed, if that can help someone who has a severed spinal cord injury, who's quadriplegic or paraplegic, if that can help their brain communicate with their legs so that they can walk again, I'm all for it. That's great, right?
It's therapeutic.
Exactly. Using that to, feed information into the mind from the AI-controlled cloud out there seems to me to be much more dangerous use of that kind of technology, trying to use it to enhance intelligence or to create a kind of cyborg that's tied into digital technologies in a way that will fundamentally alter human intelligence, human decision-making. Those kinds of applications worry me. And I would try to, you could draw on examples to explain how this might go sideways. So AI, for example. I'll just use a simple example. We have these new so-called large language model AI that a lot of listeners are now familiar with, the ChatGPT, the Grok, these things that we can query to get information. I've had patients go to ChatGPT and ask, what are the common side effects or benefits of this particular antidepressant medication that I'm thinking of taking? And assuming that the algorithm is well designed and it's drawing on reputable sources, that might be a way for this person to use that tool to synthesize complicated information and distill it down into something that's understandable to the layperson. I don't necessarily have a problem with patients using the technology in that way, as long as they're discussing that, with me as their physician. But I've also had patients go to ChatGPT and say, given my medical history, should I take this antidepressant medication, right? Treating this AI as though it's a source of wisdom or personal decision-making or as a kind of oracle that will give them answers as to how to live their life in a conversation that they probably should be having with their physician rather than with a bot or, basically what amounts to a computer program. I think even for people without faith, the Old Testament concept of an idol can be helpful to think about this. What is an idol according to the Bible? An idol is something that we create. It's an artifact or the work of our own hands that might be an interesting artistic artifact, or it might be an interesting tool that we could use to do things better. But what happens is we take this thing that is the work of our hands and we elevate it above us. And we look to the golden calf for answers or for wisdom or for decision-making or as a kind of replacement for human discernment and free will or political decision-making or whatever. And this thing then comes back to bite us because we're essentially treating it as a god, right? So I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. AI is powerful. I don't like the term AI because it's not actually intelligent. It's not actually thinking. It's just synthesizing information, doing it well or doing it poorly, synthesizing information that's already out there that has been discovered and created by human beings. So I don't think we should treat it as though it's an intelligent, sentient being. But there is this kind of danger that I see that of turning this thing into an idol.
Can you explain that a little more, this difference between sort of compiling and processing information versus intelligence?
Sure. So I've used large language model AI to take things that I have already written and synthesize them down into a shorter summary, right?
Op-ed.
Exactly.
Op-ed for the Wall Street. Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Nothing that I've published. Everything that I've published, I've written myself.
Just joking. It's fine.
But I, there have been times where I just, I needed a shorter version of this thing, for some other purpose, and it's very useful for that. But asking AI to write my own paper, to write my own book chapter, to write my own article, first of all, gives me the illusion that I know something that I don't actually know. Right? Because at that point, it's not drawing on my own work. It's drawing on the work that other people have done in order to give me some finished work product. And so I think we have to be careful believing that because I can query this thing to do some task for me, that somehow I've accomplished something or somehow I know something, or I've worked through a problem that I don't actually know and haven't actually worked through in the way that I would if I were trying to write that article myself. So these things are subtle, and there's obviously a gray area, and there's plenty of room for debate about what are the good uses of this and what are the bad uses of this. The uses that worry me the most are basically when we hand over complex decision making to these things. I do not want to be governed by bots. I want to be governed by elected representatives. As much as I may dislike many politicians, as fallible and conflicted and, quite frankly, dumb as they sometimes are, I would rather be governed by those people that I can vote out of office and that are human beings with human experiences than by some so-called artificial intelligence that supposedly is going to, take a more objective approach to this complex political or social question. But there's serious people out there who seem to think that, yeah, maybe some hybrid form of government that involves both human beings and AI making decisions on our behalf is the direction that we need to move in. And I do not think it's a good idea for us to hand over decision-making authority, wisdom, counsel, judgment, free will is not something that we want machines supplanting us and doing instead of human beings. As bad as we sometimes are at all of those things, I trust my fellow human beings more than I trust a machine, which essentially means trusting the programmers, right? So when C.S. Lewis points this out in The Abolition of Man and in his novel, That Hideous Strength, that, when we start redesigning human nature in this way, really what we're doing is giving some human beings power over other human beings. And I think that's a very useful lens through which to analyze this. When we're talking about gene editing and creating superhumans, we're talking about scientists in a laboratory manipulating human life at its embryonic stage and exercising a kind of quality control manufacturing disposition over new human beings. And what kind of expectations does that put on those new human beings, right? You're a clone of LeBron James. What do you mean you don't like playing basketball? That's not what we designed you to do, right? So we need to recognize with all of these technologies that the people who are ultimately in control of these technologies, we're essentially handing over political power, social control, data, and which leads potentially to surveillance. And from looking at it through a political lens, that means giving certain human beings, many of whom were unelected, no one chose for this role, significant power over other human beings, and trying to design and create and enhance human life in the laboratory involves those kinds of power dynamics. It's not just about making someone who's bigger, faster, stronger. It's about allowing certain people to say, okay, these embryos, we like what they're showing on their genetic testing here. We're going to implant those and bring those to birth. These other embryos that have quote unquote less desirable qualities, we're going to discard.
It's such a important point that you're making about, the trusting of AI is not, you're trusting the people that gave the inputs on the machine. So at the end of the day, you are trusting a human. It's like, who are you going to trust? Like you said, with politics, is it your elected official that you chose freely to vote for or not? Or is it someone that's unelected that is inputting and programming this machine to do God knows what?
Who's hidden and who therefore cannot be held responsible for the consequences of those.
Exactly.
things.
Okay, I want to ask you about in vitro gametogenesis, which is a new technology that's emerging. And I think people should be aware of it.
Yes. And
it's extremely problematic. So let us know, break down for us what IVG is.
So most people have heard of IVF, right? The creation of a new human embryo in a petri dish in the laboratory using donated eggs and sperm. To do IVF, the hardest part of the process is retrieving eggs from a woman's body, because typically, as most women know, your body produces one egg that's matured and that releases every month as part of your menstrual cycle. In IVF, they usually want to create more than one embryo because they want to have multiple that they can implant. Oftentimes those embryos don't survive. So they will do a process where they stimulate the woman's ovaries to create maybe half a dozen eggs that they create 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe new human beings in the laboratory. And there's ethical and moral problems associated with that. Many of these embryos are not implanted. They're kept in cryopreservation. Many of them are discarded or used in scientific research and then destroyed. So lots of ethical issues with IVF. But one of the things that limits the number of embryos that we can create is this egg harvesting process, where you can only get maybe 5, 6 embryos per cycle. And the cycle is invasive. It requires the woman take hormones to hyperstimulate her ovaries to produce more mature ovum. So it's complicated. What IVG promises to do is to be able to create gametes, and by gametes I mean male sperm or female eggs, ovum, using basically skin cells.
Wow.
So you take skin cells, you take adult cells from other tissues in the body, and you can program them using gene editing and other techniques to basically develop into gametes, into sperm and eggs. That would allow women of any age to create eggs. So no more menopause. The 80-year-old woman could develop eggs. The promise of this and the way it's being pitched is, well, what about the woman who had her ovaries removed because of cancer? Now she can't have a baby. This will allow that woman to have a baby. And, the compassionate part of us says, oh yeah, wouldn't it be nice if a woman who had her ovaries removed because of cancer would still be able to have a child who's genetically related to her? So, IVG is always pitched on those cases that draw on our compassion and our desire to help someone who has an ovarian disease. But recognize also it would allow for things like creation of eggs from males or creation of sperm from females. So, of course, many
of any age.
Of potentially any age. So many in the LGBT community who, two men who want to have a biologically related child could potentially use IVG for that purpose. The other thing that has been proposed, which, as with a same-sex couple reproducing a child who's genetically related to both parents of the same sex, some people have talked about so-called multiplex parenting. Let's suppose you had 4 people of whatever sex who wanted to have a genetically related child. You could use IVG to create sperm and eggs from 2 of them and sperm and eggs from the other 2, create 2 embryos in the lab using those gametes, extract embryonic stem cells from both of those embryos, use the IVG technique again to create sperm and eggs from those embryonic stem cells, and then create yet a 3rd embryo, discarding the first 2 embryos. Now you have essentially what is genetically a grandchild of those 4 people that they would consider their genetically related child.
And they murdered the 2 other embryos.
Exactly. And so you get this compression in space and time of the intervening generations. And you could do this as many iterations as you wanted, such that you could create a child whose biological parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were all embryos that were created and destroyed in a laboratory. And that genetic lineage simply vanished. And their only related living parents, quote unquote, are actually, great or great-great or great-great-great or whatever grandparents. And there's a lot of people that are really excited about this multiplex parenting, but obviously the sort of radical revision of human lineage, of genetic identity, of family structure, right? Even children who are raised by same-sex couples today still know that I have a biological father and a biological mother that contributed in some way to, my existence. And those people could be tracked down in some cases, and their genetic history could be something that maybe their medical history is something that maybe I could have access to. So this is very radical technology. It has not been perfected in humans. It has been done in mice. We have created mice ovum that are viable and can be used to create new mouse embryos. So other mammals, this has already been developed. There's a lot of researchers, including some in Japan and elsewhere, who are really working hard on this issue. And credible researchers in this space, who I think are not being overly optimistic, say that this may be available in humans sometime in the next 10 years.
So where is the technology today?
The technology today...
Where is IVG today?
Yeah, so the technology today is we could do this with other animals. We do this with mice.
We can eliminate a generation. So we could create sperm from a female mouse, and we can create eggs from a male mouse.
Yes.
And then we can create mouse embryos, multiples, and then we can take create gametes out of them to create a grandchild of parents that never really even, were destroyed before they grew. Like, we can do that with mice.
The creation of sperm has proven more difficult in mice than the creation of eggs, but that's very likely going to be perfected soon. So we're close to being able to do this with animals, and we I mean, I failed to mention there are other weird scenarios that could result from this too. When you think about, the difficulty in acquiring sperm and eggs makes it such that, those things are hard to steal. But let's suppose you had Brad Pitt staying at a hotel somewhere, and the hotel maid decides she wants to have Brad Pitt's children. She could scrape some skin cells off of the pillow where he just slept, bring them to some rogue lab somewhere that's doing IVG, donate her own ovum to the process, and have a child who's genetically related to someone who didn't even know that their biological material had been used in the creation of new human beings. So yeah, lots of weird possibilities, beyond the ones I've already mentioned with this technology. So this is, we're the Wild West of biotechnology in the United States when it comes to IVF. Very, very unregulated industry, which has created all kinds of, thorny issues and ethical problems that very few people today seem to want to talk about. But IVG could really explode that as well. The other thing that really scares me about IVG, Lila, is the eugenics potential, which I've sort of hinted at earlier when I talked about prenatal genetic testing. So with IVF, let's say you create half a dozen embryos in the lab. Now there are a lot of companies that are offering prenatal genetic testing so that you can test for the sex. This is being used for sex selection. And among Asian and Indian cultures, people of Asian and Indian descent, very often they're discriminating against girls, only wanting to have boys. There was an article that came out a year or two ago, I think it was in Slate, profiling women who only wanted to have daughters, right? And so you can have populations that are skewed and discriminating against either boys or girls in the creation of new human life. So sex-related discrimination is now on the table again because of prenatal genetic testing. You can also test for genetic diseases, right, and discard those who are going to be afflicted by sickle cell anemia or other genetic diseases. But some companies are now offering genetic testing to try to predict things like intelligence or eye color or hair color. So the old 20th century eugenics attitudes of, creating the quote unquote right type of human being that has whatever, the right skin color, the right eye color, is going to be intelligent, is going to be, not afflicted by disease, introduces a lot of the same discriminatory attitudes that we dealt with in the 20th century with the eugenics movement, which started in the UK and in the United States before it was exported to Germany and sort of got a bad name after World War II because of what the Nazis did with that particular ideology. But all that is now back on the table with prenatal genetic testing. IVF limits the number of embryos that we can create and test to a small handful, mercifully, although, even the creation and destruction of one human life in that context is a serious moral problem. But with IVG, you could potentially create hundreds of embryos very easily because you're not limited by that egg harvesting procedure. We're just taking your skin cells and creating eggs and sperm from those. So the possibility of so-called embryo farming, where we're creating and testing hundreds of embryos to pick that one that we deem, according to our own quality control criteria, which always ends up discriminating against someone who's afflicted by a disease or of a particular sex or whatever, creating that one optimized human being and then literally destroying or discarding hundreds of embryos, to me is a kind of nightmare dystopian scenario. And there are influential bioethicists out there who think this is a great idea. Hank Greeley at Stanford University wrote a book a few years ago called The End of Sex and the Future of Human Reproduction, where he said basically anyone who can afford it, in the next couple of decades is going to be creating new human life in this way. Even if they're not infertile, they're going to be using IVF or IVG, pre-implantation genetic testing, to optimize their children. And this will be a good thing. It's going to create a better society. To me, this will not create a better society. It will create a society in which human beings are not begotten, but made, but manufactured according to our specifications. And that will create a society that looks down upon those who, were born the old-fashioned way, according to the genetic lottery. And we stop seeing human beings as a gift to be welcomed regardless of their degree of disability, or whether they're afflicted by an illness, or whether they're short or tall or black or brown or white. It doesn't matter, right? Shouldn't matter, to the point where we've created a society where we know what is best, and we know how to create the so-called optimal human being, which can only lead to negative attitudes and discriminatory eugenics attitudes to those human beings that don't meet those standards, so-called standards. So this really worries me about IVG, not just that it will radically upend family structure, but also that it could introduce a situation in which we could radically accelerate the eugenics potential that's already at work now with current technologies of IVF and prenatal genetic testing.
You said, Aaron, that we're doing IVGs, it sounds like successfully on mice, right?
Yes.
But we have not done it successfully yet on human beings.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a foregone conclusion that that's going to happen at some time soon? I know the Chinese researchers were saying in a decade.
It seems very likely, given the fact that we can do this pretty well, not perfectly, but we can do this pretty well with other mammals, with mice. It seems likely we will be able to do this with human beings. I don't want to give a timeline, but it's not overly optimistic to think it could be possible sometime in the next 10 years.
What about human-animal chimeras?
Yes.
What about the status of that technology? And
Human-animal chimeras. This is, you take a pig, embryo, you, using gene editing, knock out the genes responsible for that pig developing pig kidneys. You insert some stem cells from a human being into that pig embryo, and then you try to grow a pig that has a human kidney inside of it. That's the idea between human-animal chimera. Chimera is a word that comes from Greek mythology, where you have a creature that's part human and part animal. That's where the word comes from. So we're not breeding a human with an animal to get something in the middle. We're actually creating an entity that has some body parts that are pig or sheep or whatever, and other body parts that are human. Why would we want to do this? Well, if you create a pig embryo with human kidneys, you can kill that pig and harvest those kidneys and use them for kidney transplant. And if the stem cells that you use to create the human kidney inside of that pig come from the recipient, then you have a perfectly matched kidney. And so you can see why this would be attractive.
Would that be ethical in your view?
Maybe. Possibly. I have a lot of concerns about it. Let me just put it that way. I might be able to be convinced under certain circumstances that it would be ethically permissible
within certain parameters,
to do this within certain
very
parameters.
Tight parameters.
But I think it's also very dangerous. So one of the reasons it's very dangerous is we're tinkering with an enormously complex system when we talk about the relationship between genes and developing certain organs or phenotypic traits. So we knock out the genes responsible for the kidneys, we put in these stem cells, and this kind of cowboy procedure. And we hope that those human stem cells only contribute to the development of the kidneys, the thing that the organ that we want, right, for organ harvesting and transplant. Well, this whole process is enormously complex. Embryonic development is something that we barely understand anything about. What if those human stem cells also contribute significantly to the development of the pig's central nervous system and the pig's brain, and we get a pig with higher humanizing type cognitive abilities? Like, what are we to make of this creature, and does this creature have a certain dignity and regard that it needs to be afforded? Questions about the human soul. All these, very difficult metaphysical questions start being raised when we are attempting to humanize, let's say, humanize animals in this way, biologically speaking. I think we're tinkering with systems that we barely understand. And I think the possibility of creating more human-like animals is a real one that cannot be dismissed. And then, how do we deal with and what do we do with those entities? And also, I'm not a person that believes that animals have rights in the same way that human beings have rights.
But they have some rights.
But they
there's certain ethical treatment. Anyways.
Exactly. There are. We can't just do anything and everything that we want to animals. I think we cannot completely instrumentalize them for scientific purposes without affording them the kind of regard and respect that's due to their nature. So yes, I'm not a vegetarian. I do eat pigs, but that I don't believe it's just okay to do anything and everything I want to a pig before I slaughter it to make some bacon. So I mean, the ethical treatment of animals is also an important consideration when we talk about human-animal chimeras.
What if theoretically you talked about the stem cell that it develops into a kidney, put it in the pig from the human. Well, you could probably do this arguably for the brain. You take a stem cells that can develop into a human brain, put that in the pig, theoretically. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the book, A Canticle for Leibowitz.
Yeah.
Really crazy, Walter Miller's, dystopian novel about, basically biotechnology gone wrong. And now we're plunging civilization into this chaos. And in that book, there are these, people walking around where it's unclear, are they animal or human?
Yep.
And how do we treat them?
Yes.
Because we've created them, Frankenstein-like experiments. And how do we treat them now? Do you think that's actually possible? Do you think we're within the realm of being able to even physically do that, technologically speaking?
It seems likely that we will be able to do something like that. I mean, we have grown human-animal chimeras already. This is being done, especially here in California. This research is not being funded by the NIH, but it is being funded by the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. This stem cell program. The state of California. The state of California is funding a lot of this.
It's so despicable what California does.
So most of this work is actually being done
by Gavin Newsom,
right here in our home state.
Wow.
And we have grown animals that are pretty close to having potentially viable human organs. So yeah, theoretically, could we develop an animal that had a much more human-like brain? It seems plausible, right? If we can use this to grow other types of tissues, it seems plausible. Hasn't been done yet as far as I know, but also a lot of this research is not necessarily being published because it's ethically controversial, and a lot of the people that are working on it don't necessarily want public blowback, right? Because you start talking about human-animal chimeras, you explain to people what it is. Most people, their immediate response is, well, this is kind of weird, and this is sci-fi island of Dr. Moreau.
And just to be clear,
stuff.
in order to do this kind of research, they're using human embryos that they're destroying, right? They're using stem cells from human embryos.
Sometimes they're using human embryonic stem cells. Sometimes they're using induced pluripotent stem cells from adults, which would be an ethical way to source stem cells from adults. So the problem with this research is not necessarily the creation and destruction of human embryos, because it can be done with adult stem cells. And what I've read about human-animal chimeras is usually they are using adult stem cells because they're easier to control. And also this idea of creating an organ that's a perfect match for a recipient, you're going to want to take those stem cells from the potential recipient. So there's that reason that pushes it away from embryonic stem cells, which is a good thing, and which is why I say, well, perhaps there would be a form of this research that I could someday endorse, although I'm very skeptical and very wary. It would have to be a form of research that does not require the destruction of human embryos.
Aaron, what do you think are the top 2 or 3 regulations, the legal parameters that should govern this space of biotechnology, specifically with regard to transhumanism? I'm going to pitch the one that's the no-brainer. You do not get to create and then kill embryos. Like, you just don't get to do it. And that's why I think in vitro fertilization, by the way, it shouldn't just be regulated, it should be banned. You shouldn't get to create embryos in test tubes. It's just not, it's outside of the natural order. It's very harmful to the embryo. It's very dangerous. It's very harmful to, many other consequences that can arise from it. So I would argue that's a no-brainer. The pro-life, don't create the embryo in a test tube, and certainly don't kill the embryo or take its pieces to use for your research. What would you say, though, are the other key parameters that we need legally to ensure that we're not doing Frankenstein-like experiments and entering into a Canticle and Leibowitz, hellscape?
Well, I would like to see a ban on IVG. I don't know if that's politically feasible.
Let's work on it, Aaron.
Same thing about IVF, but I think we need to educate people on IVG. And, even if there were, politically you had to compromise and get some carve outs for the woman of childbearing age who had ovarian cancer. I mean, maybe there, the way the political process works, you never get everything that you want, but something as close to a total ban on IVG as we could get seems necessary to preserve human dignity and to avoid the dystopian embryo farming scenarios, to avoid the radical disruption of lineage and family structure that we haven't even developed the capacity to think deeply about that technology and what it would mean. So there's this kind of reckless abandon that enthusiasts of IVG approach the whole issue with, which is kind of like, it's almost like an organized thoughtlessness. Like we're not even gonna think deeply about what does it mean to have a mother and a father? What does it mean to have two parents rather than four? I mean, even then, nobody's going to really have four parents. They're going to be genetic grandparents. But what does it mean to create and destroy entire generations of human beings? What does it mean to create a new human being whose genetic lineage was an embryo or multiple embryos that were created and destroyed in a laboratory? We don't even have the capacity to think through these questions carefully. We don't even have the language to describe actually what we're tinkering with and what we're ushering in. And that scares me. So to me, a total moratorium on IVG would be, necessary. If we can't get that as near to a total moratorium on IVG as we could get, I think is something that I would like to see happen in the next few years before this technology becomes available in human beings, and you have advocacy organizations or scientists that are wanting to do this because whatever, it's going to be profitable, or we're going to allow people to reproduce that otherwise would not have been able to do so. But I think the way in which this would upend human society and our notions of family and our notions of lineage and descent is so radical that it's not going to produce good results.
Are you hopeful, Aaron, based on even some of the appointments with the Trump administration? And by the way, folks know about this, with some of the advantages of someone like an RFK, there's also the huge challenge that he's not pro-life. He's professedly not pro-life. And how can you be the head of HHS and not pro-life? Yeah. It's a big problem, And I know a lot of people of faith are sympathetic because of his medical freedom stance, and I am too. But at the same time, what's most important here?
Yeah.
What is most important? Human dignity, basic right to life. It's foundational for everything we're working on. So, but despite the challenges, do you have a sense of hope? Do you have a sense of dread? How do you see the next 4 years, the next 10 years? I have some of both. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I share the same concerns. I'm, strongly pro-life, and, Bobby Kennedy, who I consider a friend, I have a lot of respect for him. His needle has moved somewhat in the pro-life direction in the last few months. I think being around people in the new administration has opened his eyes a little bit to some of the issues related to abortion that maybe he had taken it just standard libertarian, personally opposed, but the law shouldn't get involved was his standard approach in the past. I'm starting to see that shift a little bit in the right direction, and I think that's good. But he, clearly still has a long ways to go before he and I would have fundamental agreements on the issue of abortion or the creation of human embryos and destruction of human embryos for research or for IVF purposes or whatever. So I am cautiously optimistic that he will do more to address the chronic disease epidemic, that he will take a hard look at things like vaccine safety and liability for manufacturers and so forth, the issues that I care about. And hopefully there will be other people in the administration and within HHS that have strong pro-life convictions that can move the needle in that direction. I think that, we need a lot more
sensible regulation about chemical abortions and the abortion pills being shipped across state lines, the safety and efficacy of these products, which, were not necessarily originally developed for this purpose, but now are being used for abortion. There's a new product that there was a study published on recently, basically showing that this oral contraceptive pill in high doses might be able to be used for chemical abortion. So I have a lot of concerns about that. I think there's a lot that could be done at HHS to get better regulation, better data, better safety monitoring on that.
I mean, those drugs, it's just, they shouldn't even be on the market.
Well,
drugs to kill babies are on the market. It just...
Yes.
It's insane when you take a step back out of all the rhetoric and politics of it, and you take a step back and you're like, we literally sell drugs in America that are designed to kill babies.
Well, it's not medicinal. It does the opposite of what medicine is supposed to do, which is medicine is a healing enterprise. And so, it destroys pregnancy. To use drugs to kill either at the beginning or the end of life is something that, I've always been opposed to. What can be done at the federal level? The federal level, they could empower the states to actually make their own laws. Because if a state, say, restricts or prohibits chemical abortions, but somebody can get on their app and, basically order the drugs from the state next door and get them shipped across state lines, you've basically disempowered that state from regulating abortion in their own state, which is supposedly what the overturning of Roe v. Wade was supposed to have done. And so that decision is going to turn out to be toothless if the states can't actually make their own laws and if pro-lifers can't work state by state to make laws that better protect human life. So, some people are wanting to say this is no longer a federal issue, it's a state's issue. And I think that's a bit of a dodge of, first of all, there's a lot that can be done at the federal level to better protect human life in all stages of development from conception to natural death. But also the federal government and HHS needs to do a few basic things to at least allow the states to govern themselves in this regard. And so, so I have both hopes for the new administration, what can be done with our public health agencies, the CDC, FDA, NIH. My friend Jay Bhattacharya has been tapped to lead the CDC. He was a co-plaintiff in that Missouri v. Biden case that I mentioned earlier in the podcast. He's wonderful.
Is he pro-life?
He is, as far as I know. Yeah. Jay's a Christian. And, I think he's going to be in a position there at the NIH where he's going to have significant influence over biomedical research in the United States. And quite frankly, the NIH was funding some really gruesome research. You've probably seen this in the work that you do with Live Action and pro-lifers across the country, that fetal tissue research that should make even the most pro-choice person cringe because it was so gruesome. Human fetal tissue being grafted onto other animals and just really disgusting research that should never be done, and certainly American taxpayers should not be paying for. So I think there's a lot that can be done at the NIH. There's a lot that the FDA can do. The new FDA commissioner, Marty Makary, is a good guy. He's a Christian man. He's not beholden to many of the big pharma special interests that have captured that agency. So I think there's good people now. And I think Bobby Kennedy could be nudged in a pro-life direction, or at least maybe empower other people in the administration to deal with those issues. Because, I think the things that he's focused on.
I vote for Aaron Kheriaty.
We'll see who he taps maybe to delegate those issues to. But I think there's a lot of people in the Republican Party. There's a lot of pro-life conservatives who are concerned, and I understand and sympathize with those concerns. But at the same time, I think there's still ways to put pressure on this administration to live up to even the pro-life promises they made during the campaign. So the IVF order was certainly disappointing that we saw last week, but we've had some other executive orders that have been positive when it comes to protecting human life. And I think we need to keep up the advocacy and the political work and the pressure, and pro-life Americans need to continue making their voices heard and make it clear to the current administration that, you know, you can't abandon us, and you cannot abandon this constituency, because, you know, we're an important part of what got you into office. And, you know, there's going to be a temptation there saying, well, the other party's even worse on these issues, so you guys have nowhere else to go, so you're stuck with us, and we don't have to give you anything. And, you know, political pressure requires that, you know, people feel the consequences. If, you know, it's got to hurt a little bit if they're not sufficiently responsive to a major part of their voting base. And so, you know, I think pro-lifers should take heart that there are some good opportunities here, but we should also, you know, lace up our boots and, you know, get ready to engage in the rough and tumble of the political process to get as much as we can, you know, given the current realities.
Aaron, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's
Thanks, Lila.
fascinating stuff. You are a great follow on X, and you also have an amazing Substack, and you also write and do so many other things. Where can people find your stuff?
So you mentioned I'm on X, Aaron Kheriaty, MD. I have a Substack called Human Flourishing, where I talk about a lot of this stuff. I have a new book coming out in September called Making the Cut: The Education of a Physician and the Crisis of Medicine. So that's a book both about medical education and also about the current healthcare system. It's a critique of the current system with some ideas of how it could be made better. So folks can keep an eye out for that book. Maybe I could come back later.
Please do. We'll have you
talk
back
about
on.
it once it's out.
Amazing. Thank you, Aaron. Keep
Thanks,
up the
Lila.
amazing work. Thank you for all you do.
A huge thank you to our partner, EWTN. EWTN is the largest religious network, reaching millions of people with the truth of the faith, entertainment, and news. Check them out at EWTN.com.